So let's dive in here with the prologue, which is a joke only for English viewers who remember the 1970s. But just to give you a little bit of a preamble to thinking about archaeology in relation to the Bible, let's start with looking at a map of sort of biblical geography and the geography of the story of the Bible. So if I can get up without all my wires tangling up or falling off, you'll see right smack bang here we have Israel, and we have a number of arrows on the screen here representing the Exodus into Egypt and back, going into Egypt and the Exodus out of Egypt back into Israel. We have Mesopotamia, Assyria up here, empires that play a big role in Old Testament history, and there is a time in which the nation go into captivity in Babylonia and come back to Israel again after the Babylonian captivity. And then this arrow here is representing the spread of the gospel from Israel through the Greek world all the way to Rome in Italy in New Testament times, time of the Gospels, and then the book of Acts, of course, principally those missionary journeys of Peter and Paul and so on. So that's the sort of geography of the area that we're looking at, and you can see that Israel, being here, is really at the nexus of any trade or conflict that's going to happen between Egypt over here, one of the big powers of the ancient world, and then you've got up here the sort of Babylonian, Assyrian, Mesopotamian empires, and then in the New Testament times, the Roman Empire. This becomes the Roman world. To reconfigure that into a timeline, we have here, this is for this early days, the nation of Israel. They have a nation before they have kings. We start getting kings, or the book of Kings here. Samuel anoints the first king and so on. There's a split between the north and the south, between Israel and Judah. Then we have this exile into the Babylonian exile. The Israelites under the rule of the Romans and so on, up here into New Testament times. So that just configures the sort of timeline alongside some of the general timeline that the biblical literature up here is talking about. Yeah. So that hopefully gives you a sort of geographical and sort of timeline sense of the major movements of the biblical history. In terms of looking for archaeological evidence for these events, for that history, it's important to note that we have a very limited access to the past. Our access to the past is through the surviving remnants of that past that we happen to have discovered. And of course, the further back in history you're looking for evidence of, the less likely it is, as a general rule of thumb, that something will have survived for long enough to presently exist, to be discovered. And of course, there are plenty of things that presently exist that haven't yet been discovered. We know this because we keep discovering things. There's a constant trickle of new finds. And so that's one of the really exciting things about this sort of archaeological area. Every time I'm going to do a talk on it, I have to go back to the publications to find out what has been dug up since last time, and which slide am I going to drop from my old presentation in order to put the new bit of information in, and which is the most enticing and significant bit of data. An illustration of this, the way in which the past comes through us, through a filter of happenstance, is that of 142 books of Roman history written by Livy, only 35 of those books are known today. Only 4.5 of the 14 books of Roman history written by Tacitus have survived, or are known to have survived, into the present day. And that's in 2 manuscripts that date from the 9th and the 11th centuries. So only 2 manuscripts, quite a long time after these books were written. And yet classical historians, this is the sort of information that classical historians are well used to using as sources to critically reconstruct what happened in the past, long, long ago. So I like quoting atheists positively where I can, because they don't get everything wrong. So new atheist Victor Stenger is quite right when he notes that an absence of evidence is evidence of absence when the evidence should be there and it's not. That is, you can't say, oh, look, we presently don't have any archaeological evidence of X, Y, or Z, therefore X, Y, or Z never happened, or those people never existed. That's far too simplistic. A lack of present-day evidence only counts as a sort of reason to doubt a piece of history when that evidence should be expected to be in our hands, as it were, and it isn't. And that's not all that likely, because things have to survive, have to have been created. You have to expect that there would have been evidence left by a person or an event, that evidence would have survived all the way till now, and that we probably would have discovered it by now if it did survive. And actually, all of that, in many cases, seems quite unlikely. So we are incredibly grateful for the amount of data that does survive. We're incredibly grateful that we have 4.5 books of Roman history by Tacitus. Yeah, he wrote 14, but wow, we've got 4.5. So in archaeological terms, the glass really is half full rather than half empty, as it were. Now, of course, we all know that we live in a day of very uninformed claims about Jesus, about the Bible, about the Gospels, about history of that period. Very uninformed claims that get wide propagation, wide media coverage, wide distribution in Twitter memes and blogs and atheist websites and so on. And we have people saying things such as, Jesus probably didn't exist. For example, Victor Stenger says that. Or that the Gospels are just works of fiction. Richard Dawkins says that. Or that the idea of a divine Jesus was actually an innovation. That was a new idea. It was something decided upon at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Dan Brown, in his novel, The Da Vinci Code, has popularized that idea. Yes, it's a work of fiction, but it has popularized this idea. And you have other scholars who put the idea of a late development of a divine Jesus, of a high Christology, put that well outside of the New Testament period. But archaeology is one of the subjects that we can go to refute these kinds of ill-informed claims. So let's begin with looking at a number of categories that we can look at archaeological evidence within to give us a sort of framework. We can look at evidence for historical places in terms of cities or down to individual buildings. We can look at evidence for historical people, their general specific names, their job titles, even their relationships between people we can prove with archaeology. We can look at evidence for historical culture, the sort of historical general cultural background of the Bible, even and down to people's beliefs and practices, and also particular historical events. And this becomes interesting when we're looking particularly at the topic of fulfilled biblical prophecy. There's one take-home sort of argument to have in your minds for the rest of the afternoon. It's this argument that Lydia McGrew puts in her book, Hidden in Plain View. She uses this analogy. She says, if you sample a loaf of bread on both ends and at several points in the middle, and you find it good, it would be cavilling. It would be being far too skeptical to say that perhaps just the parts you haven't tasted happen to be the mouldy ones. So applying that to archaeology, if where we can test what the Bible says about places and people and titles and relationships and events and so on, and culture, if we can test that against the archaeological record, and the archaeological record keeps giving a positive response, a positive feedback, a response that fits with what the Bible says, that validates what the Bible says, then it would be being far too skeptical to say, well, perhaps it's just all the bits where we happen by chance not to have any archaeological evidence where the Bible is unreliable. The more that we can test the biblical witness and it proves to be reliable, where we can test it, the greater our confidence should become that the Bible is probably being reliable, even in those cases where we can't test it via the archaeology, because it has already proven itself in so many instances to be a reliable source of testimony. So that's the general background argument that one's making through these archaeological examples. There's the specific arguments of the specific examples, but there's a general background argument that's being built up at the same time, you see? So let's begin with historical places. Now this is interesting because time and time again, critics of the Bible, particularly since the 19th century, sort of 19th century liberal German biblical criticism, it's famous for this, would make that absence of evidence argument and would point at things and say, look, here's something the Bible claims is true, but we haven't got any independent evidence, such as archaeological evidence for it. Therefore, the Bible must be wrong. And you can find that kind of argument made on many an atheist website today. And Bethlehem was one of those things mentioned by the Bible that atheists said, look, Bethlehem, it's not mentioned in the writings of Josephus. Josephus doesn't mention Bethlehem. He was writing in the 1st century, Jewish historian. He doesn't mention it. The Bible mentions it, but we don't have a mention from independent sources. Yeah, we know it existed after New Testament times, but where's the evidence that it existed before or during New Testament times? The Bible is inaccurate. The trouble with making that kind of absence of evidence argument, at least it is eminently refutable when you find a bit of evidence like this that shows that actually Bethlehem did exist prior to the time of Jesus. So now your skeptical hypothesis is going to have to be, okay, Bethlehem existed prior to the time of Jesus and existed after the time of Jesus, but maybe during the time of Jesus, everyone had vacated it and it didn't exist, and the Bible's wrong about where Jesus was born because it wasn't there at the time. They say, well, what evidence have you got for that? None. So making these kind of absence of evidence arguments time after time, as you'll see, they have been refuted by digging up the right bit of evidence later on, and it becomes increasingly hard to retain your anti-biblical stance. You end up making all sorts of ad hoc, unevidenced arguments, which would be, of course, an awkward position for those saying the trouble with religion and the Bible and so on is it doesn't have evidence in its favour. So Bethlehem, here's a closer-up picture of this little seal. It's really about the size of a thumbnail. It's just a little imprint that you make in a sort of like when people used to use candle wax to seal letters open, then make a little seal impression with a stamp or your ring, signet ring, to say, this is who's sending this, or this is the bill of goods on that, this is where it's going to, and so on. It's a little, as they say, taxation or business seal of goods going from Bethlehem to Jerusalem. Quote here from Eli Sucron, who's the archaeological director of the dig. Here we read the word Bethlehem in a clear Hebrew inscription from the First Temple period on a boule, one of these little impressions found in Israel that arrived from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, probably to pay some tax. This is the Bethlehem next to Jerusalem referred to in the Bible. Another place that some atheists have been skeptical of the existence of was Nazareth, where Jesus of Nazareth, where Joseph was from, where Jesus grew up. And there'd been some archaeology that suggested there was a conurbation there. There'd been, I think, some wine presses found, some graveyard. But it was only in 2010 that archaeologists stumbled across the walls. Much archaeology tends to be stumbling across a series of small walls of houses from the New Testament period. So a quote here from the director of the excavation. The discovery is of the utmost importance. It reveals for the very first time a house from the Jewish village of Nazareth, sheds light on the way of life at the time of Jesus. The building we found is small and it's modest, and it's most likely typical of the dwellings in Nazareth of that period. And even a quote here saying, this may well have been a place that Jesus and his contemporaries were familiar with. It's a logical suggestion. So, we can't say, we've dug up the house of Jesus. There's no graffiti saying, Jesus lived here. But that there was a Nazareth during the time of Jesus, that it was a fairly modest place, etc. That does seem to be borne out by this recent archaeological discovery. Again, contrary to the claims of some atheists that Nazareth probably didn't exist because we didn't have good enough evidence for it. Capernaum, somewhere mentioned a lot in the Gospels. Jesus made it a sort of center of operations at one time in his ministry. There are 16 references to Capernaum in the Gospels, and it's the whole village is an archaeological site that you can visit now. In particular, Jesus taught in the synagogue in Capernaum, as recorded in Mark and Luke's Gospels. Luke 7 records how Jesus healed the slave of a Roman soldier who'd been posted locally. And it notes that the people had encouraged Jesus to heal this slave because the Roman officer had built their synagogue. That means, i.e., he paid for it. When we say someone built something, like Hadrian had Hadrian's wall, he had it built, not that he did it himself. So this synagogue here is actually a 5th century synagogue, the white marble synagogue there from the 5th century, but the black basalt stone at the bottom is probably the foundations of the 1st century synagogue that later on they simply knocked down the old synagogue and rebuilt it on top of the same foundations. That was common building practice. And so we have the foundations of the synagogue in Capernaum where Jesus is recorded to have taught. And indeed, Peter's house, or at least a fisherman's house from 1st century Capernaum, but plausibly, actually, Peter's house, or rather Peter's mother-in-law's house, if you remember the story from the Gospel. So it was discovered in the late 60s, where a fisherman's house, and indeed a particular room of a fisherman's house, had a 5th century church, octagonal 5th century church. Within that 5th century church, they discovered a 4th century church. The 5th century church being built around a 4th century church, and that 4th century church had been built around a 1st century house, one room of which had been plastered and converted into probably some sort of prayer meeting room, sort of house church room, and indeed had various prayers scratched into the plasterwork of that 1st century house that mentioned the name of Jesus. And the Roman Emperor Constantine, his mother Egeria, in the 4th century, records she went on a pilgrimage. She was like the first pilgrim around the Holy Lands, and she records in her diaries of that pilgrimage that in Capernaum, the house of the Prince of the Apostles has been made into a church with its original walls still standing. So this would have been the 4th century church that she would have visited, that built around this house, and then later on in the 5th century they built another one around that as well. So the Prince of the Apostles has been made into a church with its original walls still standing. It's where the Lord cured the paralytic. The Pool of Bethesda. Again, 19th century German liberalism said, Pool of Bethesda, what's that? We haven't got any archaeological evidence of this. It sounds suspicious to us. All these details in John's Gospel, which at that time they thought was probably written in the 2nd century. They thought it was really that late. Now we know that it was definitely written in the 1st century. They thought it might be 2nd century, and what is it? What would the writer of John's Gospel know about Jerusalem in the 1st century prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70? And all of this stuff about the 5 covered colonnades and so on. That's probably talking about a symbol of the 5 books of the Pentateuch, isn't it? So it's probably a symbolic story that's got no connection with historical reality. Well, you can build up theories in the clouds as much as you like until the archaeologists come along and they dig up the Pool of Bethesda, exactly where the Gospel of John said it was, and go, oh, look, it's got 5 covered colonnades. This is a more recent discovery of another pool, a ritual bathing pool, the Pool of Siloam, mentioned in John chapter 9. They were doing some digging to do work on the drainage system in Jerusalem, and they stumbled across not a series of small walls this time, but a series of small steps. And they kept digging it up, and they found 2 sides of the steps leading down into this ritual bathing pool, which is filled by water that comes through Hezekiah's tunnel. And we'll come back to Hezekiah's tunnel when we do some Old Testament stuff later. And indeed, here's some other shots. There's still some water running through this. These are the steps that lead down into the water, and here some of the pottery and a coin was discovered. One of the ways in which you date things that you uncover as an archaeologist is, the best is uncovering a coin at that level, because you get the minting date on the coin, and so that site must have been covered up after that coin had been minted. The pottery is another method of dating, because pottery styles change with dates, and through other information you're able to sort of arrange pottery styles by period. So you can say, oh look, this is a Byzantine type pot for this, or this is a 1st century Jewish type vase for that, or whatever, as well as just simply that what level of history have you dug down to, what sort of strata are you at. So they're able to very sort of precisely date this, because they found various bits of pottery for the, you would use pottery to collect water and pour water over yourself while you're washing yourself, and also coins. So that's a quick sampling. I could show you so much more, but we just don't have time. Quick sampling of biblical places, particularly places that skeptics have said, we've got no evidence for, therefore it doesn't exist. Places, now people. Here's just a few verses from Luke chapter 3, verses 1 to 2. Well, Luke, as the good historian he is situating what he's going to talk about in historical context, and he mentions a whole bunch of important historical people and titles that we're able to independently check. So Luke notes that in the 15th year of the reign of 1, Tiberius Caesar, when 2, Pontius Pilate was governor of Judah, 3, Herod was tetrarch. That's a technical term meaning the governor of a quarter of a province, tetrarch of Galilee. His brother, Philip, was tetrarch of Iturea, and Trachonitis, who's mentioned by Josephus in Antiquities, and 4, Licinius, tetrarch of Albany, during the high priesthood of Annas, and 5, Caiaphas. The word of God came to 6, John, son of Zedekiah, in the desert, John the Baptist. So we have a whole bunch of official people and titles and domains and areas and geography mentioned here. Well, let's just go through them. 1, Tiberius Caesar. Lots of archaeology representing Tiberius Caesar because he was emperor. So people tend to do things like mint coins in his names and carve statues of him and things because he's famous. Here we have a Tiberius denarius coin minted in the sort of 14 to 37 AD bracket. This is commonly referred to as the tribute penny because it's the coin that Jesus was pointing to in that story where he says, well, look at your coin. Who should you pay taxes to Caesar? He says, well, whose image is on the coin? Render unto Caesar what's Caesar's and unto God what is God's. The Pilate inscription discovered in 1961. You can see on the left there the inscription in a bit of stone. It had originally been probably a plaque declaring that Pilate had built a Tiberium, a temple to Caesar Tiberius, but it had then been later on taken away and reused in another building, and it was found in a completely different context. Some of the lettering is missing, but you can basically work out what this bit of the inscription says, that it's talking about an Iberium, a Tiberium. The PON is missing, Tius Pilatus, and the second half of his title, Prefectus, prefect, governor, or prefect of wherever he was. And of course, you then look at where it was discovered as well. Herod the Great, as we know him. Here's a bronze coin of Herod the Great. There's an inscription on this coin that indeed says Herod King, and the year that it was struck, year 3 of his reign, so that's 37 BC. In 1996, Professor of Archaeology Ehud Netzer discovered some broken pottery in Masada that bore a Latin inscription, and that inscription said, Herod the Great, King of the Jews, or King of Judah. And that's the first find that mentions the full biblical title, the full title that the Bible uses of King Herod. It's part of an amphora, or a sort of wine vessel, dates to 19 BC. So even the way in which the Bible refers to that king is independently verified. Now, fourth, Licinius was interesting because scholars said, look, Luke doesn't know what he's talking about here, because everyone knew that Licinius wasn't a tetrarch. We knew about Licinius. He was the ruler of a place called Chalcis, half a century after the time that Luke's supposed to be talking about. So here at least, we knew that Luke had it wrong, didn't we? No, because an inscription was later found from the time of Tiberius, 14 to 37 AD, which names someone called Licinius as tetrarch in Albia, near Damascus. There'd been 2 government officials with the same name, who'd had different jobs in different places. But you see how easily the skeptics sort of go from, oh, there's no evidence, or oh, here's evidence of someone with that name with an official government job and it's the wrong one, therefore Luke must have it wrong. And then we dig up something that shows, no, actually, he had it right. Caiaphas, in a tomb located to the south of Jerusalem, were discovered several of these stone ossuaries, or bone boxes, during this period of history, before the destruction of Jerusalem. The Jews had the burial practice of first burying the body in a tomb, and then later reburying the bones of the deceased into a bone box. So this particularly fancy bone box here, many historians believe relates to the former high priest Caiaphas and his family. On the side and back of the ossuary is inscribed Caiaphas' name. In the inscription, Joseph Bar, son of Joseph Bar Caiapha, or Caiaphas. So this is actually the bone box of the son of Caiaphas. Or 6. Anyone from Bulgaria here? No? Oh, well, they will be at the conference. But in 2011, there was a claim made that archaeologists had stumbled across the Bulgarian bone box of John the Baptist. Now, when it comes to finding the bones of saints, of course, we do know that during the medieval period in particular, there was a thriving industry in having the bones of saints because it attracted visitors to your monastery or your cathedral or whatever, and visitors mean money. Okay. So various nefarious things went on, unfortunately, during this time. And if you put together all of the bones that are claimed to be the bones of John the Baptist or this, that, or the other, you probably have more than a whole skeleton. Let's put it that way. However, this claim has at least some plausibility to it. The archaeologist, whose name, if I can murder the pronunciation here, Pop Konstantinov, he had an archaeological team uncovered this reliquary, or ancient container for relics, in which 8 bone pieces that were attributed to John the Baptist were found. Now, this reliquary was found embedded inside the altar in the ruins of a monastery on an island called Sveti Ivan in the Black Sea, just off Sevastopol in Bulgaria. Of course, Sveti Ivan is the island of John. Now, Professor Popkantistonov told the media that he bases the support for the find's authenticity on a Greek inscription that was found on another box that was found with the reliquary. And this inscription on the other container says in Greek, "God save your servant Thomas to St. John, June the 24th. Now, June the 24th is the official feast day of John the Baptist. The island's name, the monastery, the dedication on the box found with it in the reliquary, still intact in place within the altar, are all considered as supporting evidence for the authenticity of these bones. Now, some of the bones, when scientists looked at the bones, were discovered to be from a horse, I think. Someone had at some stage bulked up the collection at the very least. However, some of the bones were human bones, and Oxford University undertook some carbon dating tests to work out the dating of these bones. You know, are they just a collection of bones from the Middle Ages or whatever? Well, the research team dated the right-hand knuckle bone to the middle of the 1st century AD, which is smack on the mark. when John's believed to have lived until he was beheaded on the orders of King Herod. So there's some plausibility to that. There was also, you may read some reports that they were able to do some DNA analysis, which gave indications that those human bones may be of Middle Eastern origin, but those results have later been called into question as to whether there was some cross-contamination during the process of getting the bones out. So that is uncertain. This, however, I think has a much stronger claim to authenticity. Another ossuary. You can tell immediately from looking at it that these people were not rich. This is not like the ossuary of Caiaphas's family. But the inscription on here is particularly interesting. Reading, of course, from right to left in Hebrew, the inscription that the arrow there is pointing to says, Jacob bar Yosef Achud Yeshua, which is Jacob bar Yosef Achud Yeshua. So Yeshua is Jesus. Achud is brother. Joseph, bar, son of Jacob, James. James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. So mid-century AD, chalk ossuary. The trouble with this found is that I say it was noticed in 2002 rather than discovered, because it wasn't dug up during an archaeological dig, photographed in situ, etc. It was noticed by someone who could read that inscription in the collection of an antiquities dealer who'd had it for a long time, but didn't seem to know what he had, because he hadn't made anything of it. He was a Jewish antiquities dealer, and that combination of names didn't really mean much to him. Someone was visiting the collection and said, hang on a minute, that's interesting. Can I have a closer look? In 2002. Now, James, we know from Josephus, was martyred in AD 62, 29 years after the crucifixion, which would date then this ossuary, because of course James would have been buried and then later reburied, which date this a little later, from sort of 63, 64, something like that. So that would fit with the mid-1st century dating in terms of James and the history of James as well. Because of the way in which it was discovered, and I think probably because of the very complicated politics of this part of the world, there was a whole brouhaha about this, and people's weighing in on both sides as, was this authentic or was this some kind of a forgery? The Jewish Antiquities Authority took the dealer to court to prosecute him for selling forgeries. The court case fell apart, and basically all of the expert witnesses that the prosecution court called either ended up sort of retracting their accusations or giving evidence that ended up supporting the authenticity of the ossuary. And then in 2014, there was a peer-reviewed paper in the Open Journal of Geology published that supported the authenticity of the ossuary and the inscription. There were questions about, okay, it's definitely a 1st century box, but maybe someone carved a new inscription into an old box to make a forgery. And then there was a question of, okay, some of the inscription is definitely authentic, but maybe someone got an old ossuary that said, you know, James, son of Joseph, and then added on brother of Jesus to make it more interesting, to make it into a forgery. So these were the sort of questions, and this scientific investigation of the patina, the dirt, the muck that accumulates over the years in the grooves of the letterings, of the distribution of microfossils in the ossuary, of the distribution of knocks that have at one time some tiles, roof tiles, fell on the box and made scores in it, and so on. And there was this article published, The Authenticity of the James Ossuary, by Amnon Rosenfeld et al. In the Open Journal of Geology. You can get it online for free if you want to go read it. Basically saying there were these multiple lines of evidence indicating that the entire inscription was indeed authentic. Herschel Shanks, the now retired editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, which had always championed the authenticity of this find, he said that this box is, in his opinion, more likely the ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus of Nazareth, than not. That combination of names is unusual. It's unusual to put the name of someone other than the son of relationship. To put your brother on there, even though you're not bearing the brother, would be an indication that that brother was someone well known and important, and so on. So it is thought that the statistical likelihood is, as Herschel Shanks says, that it's likely that this inscription does mention the James and Joseph of Jesus of the New Testament. And you can't say it proves it, but you can say there's good plausible evidence for it. Moving on to culture, our third category here. And I'll, after that, take a pause and see if you have any questions you'd like to ask. Poor Yohanan here is our only archaeological example of a victim of crucifixion. You can see on the right-hand side there his heel bone with the nail still driven through it. At the top right there is his ossuary in which he was buried. And the bottom left there you have a reconstruction of how the nail was driven through the foot next to the heel bone. It was discovered in 1968 at a burial site with about 35 bodies in it. One, Yohanan ben Hagagol, had a 7-inch nail driven through both feet. He'd been crucified, and given that he'd then been put in an ossuary, he'd been given an honourable burial. And that's interesting because critics have sometimes said, look, because Jesus was crucified as a criminal, he wouldn't have been given a decent burial. He would have been just tossed into some sort of common pauper's burial grave to be eaten by carrion crows and the local dog packs. The biblical idea that you would bury someone like that is unbelievable. And yet our only archaeological example of an actual crucifixion victim is of someone who had been given a burial and a reburial in an ossuary. Jesus' empty tomb. You may know that there are a couple of sites that people put forward as possible sites of Jesus' burial in Jerusalem. The one that has the best claim is the one with the gaudy architecture around it, unfortunately. Dan Bahat, the former city archaeologist of Jerusalem, notes that we may not be absolutely certain that the site of the Holy Sepulchre Church is the site of Jesus' burial, but we certainly have no other site that can lay a claim nearly as weighty, and we really have no reason to reject the authenticity of this site. Recently, National Geographic were involved in a process of renovating the sepulchre. So you have here, just as we had when we were looking at Peter's house in Capernaum, we have here an earlier mausoleum built around the traditional site of Jesus' burial. And then we have a later church built around that. So we have mausoleums within mausoleums within mausoleums. Hybert from the National Geographic, here's their archaeologist in residence, noted that during that renovation process, they got down to taking away, on the right here, you can see the marble slab with the cross in that's broken, and they took away the broken marble slab that had, so say, been covering the actual rock shelf of the tomb where Jesus was laid originally. And you can see there the original rock surface underneath that rock slab. And Hybert notes that it appears to be visible proof that the location of the tomb has not shifted through time, something that scientists and historians had wondered for decades. The Nazareth Decree, a big old stone slab from about AD 41, which seems to have been found in Nazareth, why it's called the Nazareth Decree, in the 19th century. And it's a decree from the Roman Emperor Claudius, who reigned from 41 to 54. And it basically says that it's a decree saying that no graves should be disturbed or bodies removed from graves. And it's upping the official punishment for grave robbery, basically, to make it grave robbery a capital offence, where it hadn't been before. Now, a plausible explanation for this, that's quite an interesting thing for the Roman Emperor to do, to make grave robbery a capital offence. And if this was indeed found within Nazareth, given the connection with Jesus, that makes this quite interesting. And it's been plausibly hypothesized that Claudius had heard about the Christian doctrine of the resurrection and Jesus' empty tomb, and bought the Jewish idea that the disciples had come away and stolen the body. And so he had sent out a decree saying, well, let's up the punishment for grave robbery so that people don't go around claiming that their insurgent leader or whatever is raised from the dead. Now, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, mentioned it at the beginning. Here's a quote from the Da Vinci Code, a little bit of dialogue between a couple of characters. Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless. Question, not the Son of God. Right, Professor Teeming. Jesus' establishment as the Son of God was officially proposed and voted on by the Council of Nicaea, which is a church council that happened in 325 AD, so 4th century. As we English would say, this is balderdash and poppycock. Nonetheless, it's nice to be able to show that it's balderdash and poppycock simply by pointing to archaeology. So let me introduce you to the 3rd century house church at Dura Europos in modern-day Syria. Let me show you a fresco painting from the wall of the baptistry of this lovely house church. Can you make out what's going on here? So we have a man lying on a bed, and standing above him in a toga with his arm outstretched over him is this nice clean-shaven young man here. And then on to the left here, we have a man carrying his bed. The 3rd century artist seems to have taken the biblical story. This is depicting a little literally in terms of his own culture rather than 1st century Jewish culture, because you probably, in the original story, wouldn't have been carrying your bed quite like that. But what story from the Bible does this remind you of? Take this as a before and after.
The person was paralyzed for 38 years,
Right. So the paralyzed man that Jesus heals. So it's depicting a biblical story. What's the central point of that biblical story? Jesus' forgiveness of sins. Right. And the reaction of the crowd and the Jewish leadership to Jesus forgiving sins basically saying, who do you think you are? This man hasn't sinned against you. How can you forgive his sins unless you think you're God? So here we have a picture from the 3rd century in the baptistry of a story, the central point of which is Jesus making, through that miracle, through what he said, a claim to divinity. Now that's not evidence that that biblical story happened. Okay? This is in the 3rd century. That's fine, that's too late. But what this is evidence of is that there were people in the 3rd century who thought that that story was special and significant enough to pay an artist to paint it on the walls of their church in the baptistry. So that indicates to me that there were people in the 3rd century in Syria who thought of Jesus as someone who could forgive sins and therefore as divine. There's the story as it's given in Mark's Gospel. Here's another picture from the baptistry. You make out some folks on a boat here, and here's the choppy water, and here's someone standing on the water with his arm outstretched to another figure who seems to be about up to his knees in the water. I think, any stories that you can remember from the Bible where there are people on the boat and someone standing on the water and someone else getting out onto the water and sort of falling into the water a bit? Okay, so this is Jesus walking on the water. Quite an appropriate theme for the baptistry. We've got a water theme there. But put in the Old Testament context of, say, something like Job 9:8, he alone stretched out the heavens and trampled on the waves of the sea. There's Job talking about God. And then here's a story about Jesus trampling on the sea. So maybe, plausibly, again, here's an indication at least of people's mindset about Jesus. Or this is the picture right above the baptistry pool of a shepherd. Or you have a picture of a shepherd, and he's carrying a sheep over his shoulders over a baptistry pool. Jesus as the good shepherd. I am the good shepherd. And of course, the shepherd imagery, Jesus is picking up on Old Testament imagery that's used in the Old Testament of God. God is the shepherd of Israel. And then Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. And here are folks in the 3rd century, above their baptistry pool in their church, giving a picture of Jesus as the good shepherd, as God. The Lord is my shepherd. So, various indications from that 3rd century church of people thinking that Jesus was God. Well, the Christian prayer hall or church discovered in 2005 near Megiddo, dated to about 230 AD. So again, early 3rd century. We have here a reconstruction of the hall. You can see here the table for the communion in the middle, and around it some pictures made of the little tiles on the floor. And there's a picture of these in the same. So this is that one, this is that one, and so on. This is a really lovely find. It was found in the grounds of Megiddo prison. They were going to expand the prison. And in doing the work to clear the ground to expand the prison, they stumbled across these. Now on the left-hand side there, it's interesting, there's the picture of fish, and we know that fish was an early Christian symbol because the Greek word for fish forms an acrostic where you take the first letter, each of the letters of the word fish forms the first letter of another word. So that acrostic spells out ichthus, fish in Greek, and it spells out, in the English translation, Jesus Christ, God's Son, Saviour. So Jesus Christ, God's Son, Son of God, Saviour. But even more direct and impressive is one of the inscriptions on the other side of the church. So you're noting about dating it from the pottery at the end there, but the key bit, I know it's a little hard to hear, but I wanted you to have it from the archaeologist at the dig himself, that this inscription is talking about the lady who gave the money to fund the table in the middle of the room for the communion, and she gives it as a memorial to the God himself, Jesus Christ. There in an inscription, and they said they found various wine jugs and things, so this is an indication the Christians were gathering here to celebrate the Lord's Supper, and this was functioning at least as far back as the 3rd century. The God-loving Akeptus has offered the table to God, or the God himself, Jesus Christ, as a memorial. Dated to around 200 AD, so just the turn of the century into the 3rd century there. This wall graffiti, or in Latin, graffito, depicts a donkey-headed figure being crucified and a man looking up at him with outstretched arm, and the inscription that's variously translated as Alexamenos worships his God, or Alexamenos worship your God. Probably drawn by one Roman soldier making fun of a fellow soldier. Who else can we think of in this date that might be being worshipped as a god who had been crucified? So here we have, I think, pretty clear evidence around 200 AD. That's, 125 years before the Council of Nicaea, that there were people who treated Jesus as divine, someone to be worshipped. Worship his God, it says. So if we have on the right, the red line is the Council of Nicaea at 325 AD. The blue line on the left is the crucifixion, and then we've got 100-year increments marked out here. So just around the turn of the 200 there, we have the Alexamenos graffito, and just after that, the evidence from the Megiddo Church and from Dura Europos. And notice that these evidence come from Rome, from Israel, from Syria. That by that stage in history, there were people who considered Jesus to be divine in that geographical distribution around the Roman world. So there were quite a few people in quite a few geographical locations at that time, well before the Council of Nicaea, who clearly considered Jesus to be divine or God, Son of God, etc. As we Brits might say, put that in your pipe and smoke it. The Dan Brown Council of Nicaea theory. Okay, let's press on a little bit before our coffee break with Jesus, the prophesied prophet. Tom Morris, in his book Making Sense of It All, notes that a single successful prediction about a remote or an unlikely event can just be a lucky guess, of course. It's a shot in the dark that just happens to hit the target. But the more successful predictions of that sort a person makes, the less likely we are to be really satisfied with just ascribing it at all to luck. So Cicero, the Roman author, noted this kind of thought experiment about kind of playing Scrabble with the letters of the Greek alphabet. If a countless number of copies of the 21 letters of the Greek alphabet were thrown together into a box and then shaken out onto the ground, would it be possible that those letters would produce the Annals of Aeneas, would produce a great big long text? He says, I doubt whether chance could possibly succeed in producing even a single verse. And I think statistically he is right about that. If we put his argument in more formal terms, he's saying that complex or unlikely information, like a text, that complex specified information, like a text, must have an external cause. Letters, like Scrabble letters, don't contain within themselves the complex information that's contained within the information of a book, say. So therefore, if you see a book or Scrabble letters arranged to spell out a whole book, the complex specified information that that pattern exhibits had to come from outside of the letters. It had to come from outside of the tiles or outside of the ink on the page. You can't explain the information in a book by reference to the physical forces of the ink and the chemistry going on in ink on pages. So you've got to appeal to an outside cause. But natural laws, they can transmit information, but they don't create that information. Repeated laws don't create information. Indeed, chance is very unlikely to produce much of that kind of information. Whereas we do know that minds easily inform matter with complex specified information. Therefore, the best explanation of a book, say, is that a mind informed the arrangement of the letters, informed the arrangement of the ink on the paper to communicate the information that's contained therein. William Lane Craig puts it this way, with a different example. As a basis for a design inference, in addition to high improbability, unlikeliness, that's complexity, in addition to high improbability, there also needs to be conformity to an independently given pattern. So, for example, in a poker game, any deal of cards is equally and highly improbable. It's one particular deal of cards out of all of the possible combinations of deals of cards, right? Very unlikely. But if you find that every time a particular player deals, he gets all 4 aces, you can bet, that this is not the result of chance, but rather it's the result of design. He keeps getting all 4 aces. It's no excuse for him to say, hey, any deal that I make is equally unlikely. So what are you complaining about that I get all 4 aces every time I deal? Why are you suspicious? Well, because not only is there an unlikely event happening, but it keeps hitting this independently given pattern of the rules of poker, which make having 4 aces highly advantageous. With Scrabble letters, if you draw out of a Scrabble bag that string of Scrabble letters, it is complex, unlikely. It's unlikely that you would draw out that particular string of letters. But it is not specified. That's nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't do anything. Or you might draw out the word dog. Well, that is specified. It's the word dog. But it's not very unlikely that that would happen when you're playing Scrabble. Occasionally you draw out a small word. It's not complex. But if you're playing Scrabble and you drew out the following sequence of letters, all things do become, have become, and will become, some by nature, some by art, that is design, and some by chance, Plato, Laws, book 10 actually. Well, that sequence, that event, is both complex and it's independently specified, and it's clearly the product of art, of design. Someone enters a sequence of numbers into a cash machine, a hole-in-the-wall machine, and it gives them money. Were they lucky? Well, maybe they were lucky, but were they lucky, or did they get the money by design? We would tend to think they got it by design, they knew the PIN number for that account. When a complex event matches an independently given or specified pattern, we naturally, intuitively, reasonably infer design. Now, a PIN number has 4 digits. It's just like this combination lock here. We've got 4 tumblers, 0 to 9, so 10 each. 4 digits each with 10 options. So there are 10 to the power of 4 different PIN numbers that are possible. That's the range of all possible PIN numbers, 10 to the power of 4. A 1 in 10,000 chance, in other words, of a specific PIN being guessed correctly on any particular attempt. Of course, the more tries that you have, the more likely it is that you break the combination. But any particular attempt, it's a 1 in 10 to the 4, 1 in 10,000 chance. If we put more tumblers on this, the way that statistics works, you have to remember, it's not that you have 1 in 10 plus 1 in 10 plus 1 in 10 plus 1 in 10 and so on. So you have 1 in 10 multiplied by 1 in 10, multiplied by 1 in 10. So the more tumblers you have, the possibilities increase kind of exponentially, as it were. You get a huge inflation the more tumblers that you have. So here's a great big long combination lock. There's 10 to the 4 with 10 there, and we go up, and we'll come back to this as an illustration of the probabilities involved in prophecy if we go through. So in terms of applying this to thinking about fulfilled prophecy, making a design inference for fulfilled prophecy, here are my criteria. If there's a close, i.e. a specific match or correspondence between, on the one hand, the most plausible reading or interpretation of a prophetic prediction, and, on the other hand, a sufficiently improbable or complex event or series of events, if there's this match, then the best explanation for there being that match is design. And actually, that's not controversial. The difficulties come in step 2. In such a case, if the evidence indicates that the prediction was written before the event happened, and the fulfillment event, the evidence indicates that that fulfillment event wasn't humanly invented or manipulated to fit the prediction, then the natural explanation of that match would reference the supernatural resources of the religious context of the prophecy. Because what the skeptic, of course, is going to say is, yes, I see that there's a match between the prophecy and the event. The prophecy must have been written after the event in light of knowing that the event happened. Or someone read the prophecy and deliberately did something to fulfill the prophecy. And that's why there's a match. Of course, the match is by design, but is the design by people in mundane explanatory terms, or is the best explanation of that match a supernatural explanation, i.e., this is fulfilled prophecy? That is where the argument is going to be. And the key to engaging in that argument is to say, we can't just beg the question against the supernatural explanation by saying miracles can't happen, fulfilled prophecy can't happen, therefore the explanation must be a mundane one. Rather, what we have to do is look at the evidence and say, what does the evidence show? What is the evidence for the dating of the prophecy in relation to the events? And what is the evidence about what caused the events? Did the people doing the event read the prophecy and deliberately fulfill? Because sometimes that does happen. So, for example, Jesus riding a donkey into Jerusalem, yes, it's fulfilled biblical prophecy, but it's not a good place to go for an argument for fulfilled biblical prophecy, because I think it's pretty clear that what happened was Jesus read the scriptures, arranged to get a donkey, and rode it into Jerusalem in order to say, I am the Messiah. I am laying claim to being the Messiah by doing this. So he was making a claim by doing that, but he was clearly deliberately fulfilling that prophecy. So, okay, just say, well, I'm not arguing from that kind of example. I'm not going to argue from that kind of example. We try and argue from examples where there's evidence that the prediction was before the event and that the event wasn't humanly manipulated in order to fulfill the prophecy. So those will be the key points. The stuff about specified complexity, actually, that's not particularly controversial. That only gets controversial when you apply it to biblical prophecy or when you apply it in making a design argument or what have you. That's an area that overlaps with this. But we'll come back to fulfilled biblical prophecy after coffee break. Grand. Thank you very much. So I was saying before the break about the sort of criteria for the fulfilled prophecy argument, and noting that we don't want to beg the question against the possibility of prophecy, but simply to push people to follow the evidence on things like the dating of the prophecy, according to the evidence relating to the dating of the document and so on. And in terms of Old Testament documents, let me just point you to this resource, Craig Davis's book, Dating the Old Testament. He has a website that goes along with that as well, which is a good first stop to go to in terms of the arguments about the dating of various Old Testament scriptures. But of course, we do have, when we come to looking at messianic prophecies fulfilled in Jesus, the advantage that the Old Testament had definitely all been written before Jesus' day. And we can show this archaeologically through the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date to about 150 BC. Copies of many books of the Old Testament, including famously the book of Isaiah. And of course the Septuagint or Greek translation of the Old Testament also dates to about 150 BC. So both of those show that the Old Testament writings existed well before the New Testament era. This question the other question of, well, is it historicized prophecy? Are people just looking at prophecies and then making up that certain events happened? Well, really that's asking, is there good enough evidence to think that those prophecy-fulfilling events really happened? And that is the question, isn't it? But I think it is good to note up front that there are various arguments showing that it's sort of implausible as a general rule that these New Testament writers were minded to just make things up to fulfill prophecy. It's implausible in light of their general honesty about themselves, where they tell stories that put themselves in a bad light, which shows their honesty. And if they're that honest that they're prepared to put themselves in a bad light, then would they be prepared to just make up events in order to claim that Jesus fulfilled them? So their integrity displayed in the rest of the writing seems to count against that theory. It's implausible in light of their willingness and the fact that many of them were certainly martyred for their faith, which shows their genuineness. They themselves explicitly say that they didn't just follow cleverly invented stories and make things up. And Stephen Davis notes that if early Christians had been minded to just make things up that were useful to them, then it would be plausible to think that they would have made up, say, Jesus giving teaching that dealt with the very contentious issues within the early church, particularly relating to Gentiles coming into this Messianic Jewish movement, would have resolved a lot of early church conflict if the disciples had been minded to say, oh, well, yeah, don't you remember everyone? Jesus said, and then just make something up. But they didn't do that, although it would have been convenient for them to do so. Again, speaking to the integrity of what they say. So in my book, this material here that I'm drawing on comes from my book, Understanding Jesus, where I look at prophecies of Jesus that he fulfills in a number of different categories. Here's a list of just 8 prophecies about the Messiah's origins. Now, of course, Jesus can't have arranged for himself to be deliberately born to a particular family, particular tribe, particular culture, etc. Or if you look at 4 prophecies about the Messiah's predicted actions from the Old Testament. This includes, and we may have time to look at this later, things about the Messiah himself being a prophet, being at least believed by his contemporaries, shall we say, to heal various ailments. Now, that's a little bit tricky, because if you say Jesus fulfilled these prophecies about healing people, then of course that itself raises a sort of double strength, as it were, this issue about, well, can miracles happen? But again, if you boil the question down to, is there evidence that these things happened, then certainly you can give evidence according to standard historical canons, like multiple attestation, enemy attestation, etc., that show that Jesus was at least believed by his contemporaries to be a healer, which is something that fulfills messianic expectation from the Old Testament. So I've got some, you can see I've got back of the envelope calculations, and you are making back of the envelope calculations here about the numbers. But the thing to do there is to just try and be very conservative about those numbers. So you're using numbers like, well, let's give Jesus fulfilling this prophecy a 1 in 10 chance. Well, that would mean that 1 in 10 people in Jesus' day were fulfilling that prophecy. I mean, that's ludicrously generous. But because of this multiplication thing that I mentioned earlier, the numbers soon do increase. So for Jesus' fulfillment of those 12 prophecies, back of the envelope calculation, but erring on the side of caution, 1 chance in 170 million by the time you factor them together. If you took 15 aspects of Jesus' fulfillment of famous passages like Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22, if we assigned a 1 in 4 chance for each aspect of the fulfillment, again, I think that's being very cautious, you would get odds of about 1 in 1,074 million for his fulfillment of those prophecies. So we can, and I emphasize, conservatively estimate that Jesus had 1 chance in 182,580 million. That's 1 in 1.8 times 10 to the power of 23 of fulfilling just 27 Old Testament Messianic prophecies by chance. We know for sure from the archaeology in the Septuagint that these were written before, 150 years at least, before Jesus' day. And it's very implausible to say that Jesus or anyone deliberately manufactured the events that we're looking at in order to fulfill them. That Jesus that it was deliberately manufactured that Jesus would be able to fulfill the prophecies about the lineage that he comes from, or where he would be born, or how he would die, or what the soldiers would do with his clothing, gambling with it whilst he was being crucified, or these things. We've tried to be careful to exclude from these lists of prophecies things like Jesus deliberately riding a donkey into Jerusalem to make a messianic claim. So, to give an analogy for those numbers, because those are just give you an analogy, you've got more chance of successfully picking at random on your first attempt a single pre-specified grain of sand out of all of the grains of sand on planet Earth than Jesus had of fulfilling those prophecies by chance. There are about, roughly, it is estimated by scientists, 10 to the 23 grains of sand on the planet. So the calculations were conservative. We could say that some of them, you could raise this issue of some of them were maybe about supernatural events themselves, being a prophet and being a healer. Or I've talked a little bit about how we can deal with that. But say, okay, let's be even more cautious. Let's set aside any fulfillments of prophecy that are themselves inherently miraculous, as it were, such as healings. Let's go with James Dietz, who in a paper of his lists just 25 Old Testament prophecies and assigns a very conservative 1 in 4 chance to each of those events. That means a 1 in 10 to the 15 probability of chance fulfillment. And he himself notes if any of those prophecies that he lists are objectionable to the reader, and indeed one of them is objectionable to me, he uses the fulfillment of Hosea 11:1 about I've called my son out of Egypt, which in the original Old Testament context is talking about God bringing Israel out of Egypt, and is applied in the New Testament to Jesus coming back out of Egypt when he'd escaped from Herod when he goes into exile in Egypt temporarily, and they apply that verse to him. And I think, well, okay, that's a typological use of Old Testament there, and it's not really something that I would use in a fulfilled prophecy argument, so I'm going to swap that out for one of the other 27 that I've given. So 25 at 1 in 4 each still gets you to 1 in 10 to the 15, which is a pretty impressive number. It's 1 quadrillion officially. That is the estimated total number of ants alive on planet Earth. So not as many ants as there are grains of sand, but there are still, I'm sure you can try and imagine, quite a lot of ants around. Let's put it onto our long tumbler combination lock here with probability of the considered fulfilled prophecies clustering around Jesus at between 1 in 10 to the 15 and 1 in 10 to the 23, depending on which ones you want to use. Now, one of those prophecies that I'd used in my 27 list was that Jesus would himself be a prophet. Deuteronomy 18:15 talks about the Lord God raising up a prophet from among you like Moses from your fellow Israelites, and so on. Origen, born in the 2nd century, reported that the Greek writer Phlegon, writing in the 1st to 2nd century, knew of Jesus' prophetic power. Now, Phlegon, he says, in the 13th or 14th book, I think, of his Chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events, although falling into confusion about some things which referred to Peter as if they referred to Jesus, but also testified that the result corresponded to his predictions. Interesting second-hand enemy testimony. Let's give one example here, focus on one example that Ian Wilson notes about the temple, that Herod's seemingly so permanent temple, which Jesus predicted would be destroyed within a generation of his time, did indeed suffer that fate. So going back to Mark's Gospel, which for reasons I don't have time to go into here, I date maybe as early as 49 AD, talks about Jesus on leaving the temple and the disciples admiring the temple and the massive stones of the temple, and Jesus saying, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So we have here a computer image of the second temple of Jesus' day, and the Temple Mount, photo of the Temple Mount as it is today. And of course you can see that not one stone of the original temple is left on another. Now, as Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, said, confirmations should count for your theory only if they're a result of a risky prediction. So how risky is it to point at an ancient world giant temple complex and say that will be destroyed, let alone that will be destroyed within a generation? Well, as a travelling speaker for ELF, I had the privilege a few years ago to go to Athens in Greece and spend an afternoon visiting the Parthenon. So that is an equivalent massive temple complex from the ancient world. And although it is looking a bit worse for the wear, and apologies for having nicked all of the marble statues and put them in the British Museum, but the Parthenon and its temples on the Temple Mount there in Athens is still standing to this very day. Despite the Parthenon itself having been used as a gunpowder store during the war with the Turks, and a shell hitting it and the whole gunpowder store exploding. So you can't just point to any old temple complex and it be necessarily likely that you're going to be right, that it's not risky to point at it and say, this will be destroyed. It becomes even more risky if you say this will be destroyed within a generation. And indeed, as we'll see, Jesus is even more specific than that. As we know from history, in AD 70, at the end of the Jewish-Roman War, from 66 to 70, the Romans under Titus, who then became the Emperor Titus, destroyed the Jerusalem temple. And here we have a frieze from the Titus triumph arch in Rome of the Jewish soldiers carrying off goods from the temple, including the Jewish menorah candlestick there from the temple. We're told that at a distance, the whole temple, and there's a model mock-up on the left there, looked literally like a mount of snow fretted with golden pinnacles, white marble cladding and golden leaf inlay. The temple was destroyed when the Romans took over it because the Jewish rebels, they holed up in the temple as a kind of final fortress. So the Romans attacked that first to get into Jerusalem to get the rebels. A fire, we don't know who set it, how it caught, but a fire destroyed the temple. The fire caused the gold fittings and the gold gilding inside and out of the temple to melt. And the gold ran in between the cracks in the stonework of the temple. You pay your soldiers in loot, partly. The soldiers wanted to loot the place. They pillaged the temple. They levered apart the stones of the temple in order to get to the gold that had melted in between all the cracks. And in this process, chucked the stones of the temple off the Temple Mount. If you compare Jesus' predictions about the temple from the synoptic Gospels of Luke and Mark, it seems to me that there's a bit of a difference in what he says there that you could summarize this way. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies coming for Jerusalem, you better get out of there because bad times are a-coming. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where he or it does not belong, then it's really, really important that you get out of there because really bad things are about to happen. Armies flee, abomination, flee right now, the end is nigh. Seems to me to be the message. Now the abomination that causes desolation is much discussed, and various commentators link it with the events of AD 70, when, having forced his way into the temple sanctuary, the soldiers of Titus set up their Roman standards in the temple, which the Jews would have considered as like pagan iconography icons, pagan statuary. They sacrifice to their pagan icons in the temple, desecrating the temple, and that this is the desecration event. But commentator Robert Stein book that I otherwise recommend, Jesus, the Temple and the Coming of the Son of Man. He argues that this event in AD 70 is too late to serve as a sign to flee Jerusalem, he says, although actually what Jesus says it's flee Judea, which is broader than Jerusalem, to flee because it's after the siege of Jerusalem when flight was no longer possible. But here archaeology has something interesting to say. We've known that since the 19th century that there are various tunnels underneath Jerusalem, in the rock underneath Jerusalem. There's a tunnel, a main drainage sewer there in yellow lines that runs all the way from the temple down to the south, for example. A Jewish historian talks, and you can see a picture of him inside one of these tunnels here, notes about underground passages enabling inhabitants of Jerusalem to exit the city and flee south to Masada and via the Nahal Kidron and other wadis heading from Jerusalem eastward to the Dead Sea during the siege. Ronnie Reich of the University of Haifa and Eli Sukron, Israel Antiquities Authority, note that there's evidence in the writings of Josephus that various people took shelter in these underground channels, such as the drainage channel, and lived in it during the siege until they succeeded to flee the city. Well, some of them got discovered and murdered by the Romans after they'd finished with the temple. That's when they moved on to slaughtering the inhabitants of the city. And indeed, if you track down the references in Josephus' Jewish War, he talks about the subterranean caverns and the Romans searching for Jews underground and slaughtering them when they come across them. But here's the real key bit of evidence. Josephus talks about Judas, the son of Jairus, who had been a captain of a certain band at the siege of Jerusalem, and by going down into a certain vault underground had privately made his escape. And later on in Jewish War, he talks about the Romans catching up to Judas, the son of Jairus, and his band of men and slaughtering them in a battle in a forest later on. So here is historical evidence that links with the archaeological evidence of the actual tunnels that we've discovered, that it was possible to get out of Jerusalem during the siege of Jerusalem. So it is, I think, possible that desecration of the temple was the sign before the Romans go on to slaughter the population that Jesus is talking about when he says, when you see the desecration of the temple, it's really important that you get out. You know, you might have to know someone who works in the sewage department in order to know which hole to go down, but it was possible to get out. Too many quotes here to go through, but were these prophecies backdated again about this fulfillment of the temple and so on? Think again, the evidence shows it's very unlikely, because although the specificity of the match of what Jesus says, and I would date the Gospels to pre-65, pre-70 AD, the match is there and you want to explain it, I think the dating evidence does point to earlier, and although the specificity of what Jesus says, which makes this unlikely match uncomfortable, is pretty specific, it's not specific enough in the Gospels to make you think, this is what you would write if you were writing it after the event, as it were. There are some things that I think you probably wouldn't write if you were writing it, making it up after the event. So, for example, Matthew and Mark have verses where Jesus invites the disciples to pray that the siege of the city won't happen in winter. But we know that the siege happened during April and September. 70 AD, that was when the breakthrough happened, April to September. That was the key dating. Luke reports that the same thing as Mark, that the disciples Jesus says, flee to the mountains. And we know from early Christian sources that the Christians did flee Jerusalem because they knew this prophecy, but we know that they didn't flee to the mountains. They didn't go up, they went down, they fled to the coast. They went to Pella on the coast, several hundred feet lower than Jerusalem. So if you were just making up that Jesus made these prophecies beforehand, why would you have Jesus saying, flee to the hills, flee to the mountains, rather than flee to the coast, to make it fit even more, because you would know that. So there are various indications. I think if you just follow the evidence, it seems that these prophecies date from beforehand, and there are things that don't quite fit with saying they were just made up afterwards. We don't have time to go into the datings of all of the Gospels, but if you want more on that, I refer you to the relevant chapter of my book, Understanding Jesus. Again, note the specificity that we do have of the predictions, though. This will happen within a generation. There'll be no stone left on another. The stones will be thrown down. The desecration of the temple and fleeing being really important at that stage. So we've got 4 predictions there. If we gave odds of 1 in 10 to those, that's 1 in 10,000. That's your pin number. That's breaking this lock again. But indeed, there's more. If you go through, what Jesus says in Mark 13, there are 12 specific predictions that Jesus makes in Mark 13 that are verified as having happened, fully verified. I think 2 of them are partially verified, but at least 10 are fully historically verified. Again, at odds of 1 in 10, that would be 1 in 10 to the 12. Let's lean over backwards to be cautious on this calculator. It's 1 in 4. Well, that's still 1 in a million and 1 in 10 to the 6, just for that prophecy. Jesus made other prophecies, both short and mid and long term as well. Give these a slightly more realistic, but still generous 1 in 100. That would give you odds of 1 in 10 to the 8 for these. So combine those together, even more. Load those on top of the ones that we've already looked at for the messianic fulfillments. The probability of the considered fulfilled prophecies clustering around Jesus, and now combining those with the ones from Ditz or me, now move up to something like 1 in 10 to the 29 to 1 in 10 to the 43. These are astronomically big numbers. Right, let's see what I get to in our last section here. Back to our Old Testament times. Let's jump in at 1100 BC. So this is a long, long time ago now, over 3,000 years ago, and not very much, unsurprisingly, survives from back then. So if we have anything that survives from back then and that we've discovered, we've managed to dig up and someone's not living on top of, wouldn't want their house being dug up and so on, we should be very grateful. And indeed, there still are things. So this is an 11th century BC stone seal, possibly depicting a man fighting a lion. You see the lion's on the left, and its tail curving up, 4 legs and a head. A man on the right, man fighting a lion. Discovered at the site of Beth Shemshah, the House of the Sun, in 2012. The location, the date, and the image, which resembles contemporary depictions of lions, that's why I thought it would be a lion, matches the Samson and the lion encounter from Judges 14. Beth Shemshah is located about 19 miles west of Jerusalem, near the Iron Age border between the Israelites and the Philistines, who feature in that story. According to Judges, Samson was born, lived part of his life, and was buried across the valley from Beth Shemshah. That's in Judges 13, 16, 31, and so on. Samson's killing of a young lion in Judges 14 is said to have happened on his way from his family home, which is thought to be located a few miles away from Beth Shemshah. So you cannot point to this and say, there you are, there is a picture from the time of Samson wrestling a lion. Because it doesn't say on it, this is Samson killing a lion. But you can at the very least say, oh look, isn't it interesting that we have a depiction of a man fighting a lion, or a man with a lion, from that historical period, from the right geographical location, where we have a biblical story that talks about someone wrestling a lion. the cultural background that we know from archaeology fits the culture that's described in the story, at the very least. Judges 16 describes Samson's death in the temple of the Philistine god Dagon in Gaza, where he's chained between the pillars of the temple. Remember, and he pushes over the pillars of the temple and brings the temple down upon himself and his tormentors, his captors. Well, the Gaza temple of Dagon has yet to be excavated because there's a modern city sitting above it, and people don't want their city dug up in order to get at it. But it was probably similar to the Philistine temple at Tel Kizil, which was destroyed in the early 10th century BC and which has been excavated. And here is part of the excavation from this other Philistine 10th century BC temple. And you will note that in the center of the temple here, there are two columns in the temple that held up the roof of the temple. They're about, in this case, 7 foot apart. But it shows from the archaeology that the design of the temple that's described in the Judges story matches with the known archaeological record that the architecture of these Philistine temples could and indeed did include having pillars in the temple close together that held the roof up. So it's not a stretch to imagine Samson chained between two pillars in this other temple in such a way that he could have pushed them over, pulled them over, whatever. We come on to the era of King David, where skeptics of the Bible have said that there wasn't any independent evidence that there was a King David or a house of David, and if he did exist, when they were sort of forced to concede that he did exist, it wasn't the sort of golden age of Israel that the Bible depicts. It must have been a small tribal kingdom that didn't have much power and so on. The Bible must be inflating the stories because you tend to inflate your national story to make yourself appear big and important. And that's obviously why the key event of the national story of the Israelites is how they all came from a group of slaves, because that really makes you seem important. See the problem here with that kind of approach. But King David, there are various inscriptions talking about David and the house of David that have been found that show that there was indeed a King David, including most notably perhaps the so-called Tel Dan inscription, which hopefully, if the technology works, I have a little video of. We find things like, again, back to a little boule. We started with a boule from Bethlehem, business boule from the Davidic kingdom from the 10th century. Or this one's an interesting one, a bit of pottery, 2005 discovery from near the hometown of, well, would have been his hometown if he's a real person, Goliath, the Philistine city of Gath. There's a Semitic inscription dated to the 10th to 9th centuries BC with a name on there that resembles the name Goliath, showing again that the story of the Bible at least matches with the cultural background. It's not the name Goliath, but that's the kind of names that people had at the time. David and Goliath story. King Solomon. Solomon follows David, of course, and again, people were downplaying Solomon until we start discovering bits of archaeology that seem to match the biblical descriptions, such as a wall that King Solomon had built, according to Kings, unearthed in 2010, or King Solomon's mines, the Rider Haggard stories and so on. But until 2013, this mine was considered to be a late Bronze Age site that related to the New Kingdom of Egypt. But then they started doing carbon dating on some of the donkey dung and so on at the site, as well as textiles and various organic materials at the site, and showed that this mining camp's heyday was in fact in the 10th century, the era of the biblical kings of David and Solomon. Evidence, Thomas Levy here saying, evidence that complex societies were active in the 10th and 9th centuries BC, and brings us back to the debate about the historicity of the biblical narratives. We can't believe everything ancient writings tell us, just because they do, but this research represents a confluence, a match between the archaeological and scientific data and the Bible, says the archaeologist. The site had about 100 buildings, including a fortress, in the middle of a 24 acres of land now covered in black slag of the mining there. So archaeologist Ben Yosef says that the Bible's claim that David brought the Edomites to heel is accurate. There's a serious possibility that Jerusalem did get its wealth from taxing these mining operations. And then, of course, King Solomon embarks on a building campaign using those riches. Many of the implements used in worship were made of bronze, requiring much copper to form that alloy, as mentioned in 1 Kings. So this is the source of those materials and that wealth for the Solomonic kingdom. We note in 1 Kings, in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem. And indeed, in the bottom stratum of this mining site, it reveals there was a period of mining that lasted about 40 years, and then there was a major disruption in the mining operation, followed by a resumption of the mining operation. And archaeologists have linked this pause in the mining operations operating with this war with Egypt, and indeed have found Egyptian scarabs from the Eastern Nile region, and an amulet linked to the Egyptian goddess Mut at this site as well. So there was certainly some Egyptian link there. 1 Kings 14:25 says that after Solomon's death, Israel and Judah were invaded by Shishak, the Egyptian pharaoh, who began raiding and conquering much of Palestine beginning around 925 BC. So again, linked with the biblical stories. Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen thinks that there's an Egyptian inscription that mentions a place that he thinks should be understood as the Heights of David in an Egyptian topographical list about these campaigns, Egyptian campaigns into this territory. And he thinks that one of the campaign lists a place called the Heights of David, which would be plausibly another reference to David and the Davidic kingdom. How are we doing here? Woohoo! We've got to stop a few minutes early so people have time to do filling out forms and things as well. But I think we have a few minutes. Let's see what else I can just drop in here. Although I love the name, the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III. This is in the British Museum. You can go and visit it if you're ever in London. And it contains, this is Shalmaneser III down here. and he's at the time of King Jehu of Israel, who is depicted. This is the earliest picture we have of a king of Israel from the 9th century. He's mentioned in 2 Kings. There's a close-up. There he is, bowing down to Pharaoh, giving tribute to him. And it talks about the tribute of Jehu, son of Omri, and the things that Jehu gave him as a vassal king, paying taxes to him. There's Jehu and Shalmaneser, and so on. So, I'm going to go through to the end here. Yeah. So I'm jumping over. I had some material about the Babylonian exile and the book of Daniel and so on, and the campaign of when the Assyrian king tried to conquer Jerusalem and didn't manage to do it. And there's very interesting stuff that we have a record from the invaders' side of that story, listing all the cities of Israel, so on, that he took, that he surrounded Jerusalem but didn't take it, and then he went off home. And of course you have the biblical story featuring the prophet Isaiah saying that Jerusalem won't be taken by him, and they mesh very nicely. One last bit of archaeology, because this is a fairly recent find, if I can find the slide, that I will bring to your attention, talking about Isaiah and Sennacherib's attempted attack on Jerusalem. This is a very recent find, 2018. It's another seal impression. This is very plausibly the seal impression of the prophet Isaiah. It was found in Jerusalem near to the royal complex, just a few feet away from where a seal impression of King Hezekiah had been found. And you can, again, look up from this on the recommended resources. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of a fingerprint impression on the seal that smudged the bottom word. A bit of the top is missing, and a bit of the bottom word has been smudged as it was being made. But I think it's very plausible, the interpretation of this sealer as mentioning Isaiah, belonging to Isaiah the prophet. And you can read about that in Biblical Archaeology Review, where in the edition that was celebrating Herschel Shanks stepping down as the editor, because he's friends with this particular archaeologist, she published this result in there for the first time. That was where the first sort of announcement publication was. But as I say, when I say they're still digging stuff up, they really still are. They found this over a year ago, I think. They noticed the Hezekiah one, but it takes time to go through the findings and to assess them, and then to go through the publication process and so on. And so, who knows what stuff they already have dug up, but they just haven't noticed what it is yet, let alone the stuff that they haven't dug up that's still out there. But certainly if we review quite a sampling of things from Old and New Testaments that people have found, have discovered, we can say, like sampling that loaf of bread. Remember that illustration that we started with? That where we can independently check what the biblical authors tell us, time and time again, including in instances where people have been skeptical because of that lack of independent evidence, we find the biblical accounts get verified by the archaeology, get clarified, that the background matches the cultural background, that even specific people and titles, relationships between people, particular events in terms of fulfilled prophecy also get independently verified, or we get a background that helps clarify what's going on, such as when we were looking at, is it possible to escape from Jerusalem once the siege has started? And you get not only written evidence from Josephus, but then that matches with the archaeological evidence of finding. It was only recently that they rediscovered that central drainage ditch in Jerusalem, for example. That happens in terms of the Old Testament and in terms of the New Testament. So what you make of the fulfilled biblical prophecy aspect of this will depend mainly upon the worldview that you bring to the evidence, whether you beg the question against it or not, whether you're willing to go in line with what the evidence says. But even setting aside the question of prophecy, the archaeological evidence shows that in all these cases that we've considered, the Bible presents us with accurate information about what happened in history. But the thing is, the more evidence, the more reason you have for thinking that the Bible repeatedly tells you accurately about what happened in history, the more reason you have to think that the Bible is being accurate when it reports the existence and fulfillment of prophecies, including the ones that we've looked at. So you have a general argument going on in the background of looking at the particular cases and then putting all of that together, and I think you have quite a powerful evidence for historical reliability of the scriptures and for there being an argument from fulfilled prophecy that can be mounted using that data that also brings in looking at archaeological data from outside of the biblical text.